Donald Trump has said that India has reportedly stopped purchasing oil and called it a good step from Russia. This comes after his tantrum throwing, calling India and Russia dead economies, imposing penalties and making it clear that he wanted India to stop purchasing oil from Russia. Then Reuters came out with a report that claimed that India had begun stopping these imports. Bloomberg also in fact claimed that a Russian tanker was lying idle due to India refusing Russian oil. A map tracking the ship later disproved Bloomberg's claims. Indian government sources responded and said that India's energy purchases are driven by national interests and there were no reports of Indian oil firms halting Russian imports. India has been dealing with Trump's pressure tactics, threats and tantrums calmly. But amidst this issue, of course, how does India continue to traverse this crisis? Joining us is Madhav Nalapat, editorial director of the Sunday Guardian. Mithali Nikore, economist, joins us live. Dr. Jaideep Bhattacharya, President CDEPR, is also with us live. Ambassador Bhashpati Mukherjee, former diplomat, also is now joining the broadcast. Professor Nalapat, let me make a start with you first. What do you make of these reports coming in from various Western media outlets actually propounding the theory that India has stopped Russian oil imports, something that even now President Trump has reacted to and welcomed?
Look, Uday, I'd like to point out that India acts in its own interests and the interests of no other country, and whenever it's in its own interest, it will do what is necessary. As far as Russia is concerned, frankly, President Trump has been trying to get Russia and Ukraine to do a peace deal, and he has been trying to work very hard in diplomacy with President Putin. And of course, unfortunately, some intemperate remarks were made by former President Dmitry Medvedev, but and Trump, of course, responded in his usual, characteristic fashion, which is non-proportional to Medvedev's comments. But having said that, I'd like to point out that Russia has been a long time supplier to India of oil, and if you were to stop Russian oil from the market, then you're going to spike the oil way back to what it was, I think about 3 years ago, more than $140, $150 a barrel. And that's going to tank the Indian economy, it's going to tank the US economy, it will completely upset the entire global economy. So personally, I don't think it's a realistic proposition to stop Russian oil. And this is, I'm supposing, let us say, India stops it. Do you think Russia is going to stop exporting its oil? It will export. It will export more of it, the India share, to China. And China will gain the benefit of lower prices. China will gain the benefit of holding Russia in even tighter embrace than it already has. And some of us were under the impression that Donald Trump is, has got a very shrewd strategic mind. We stand by that impression, and that shrewd strategic mind has basically said that the Russians should be weaned away from China. And that, I think, is absolutely the right course of action. And in that, India will be a partner, there's no question. But you can't be a partner and you give a slap. You can't be a partner of the US and get slapped. You can't be a partner of Russia and give a slap. So I think the government of India is perfectly right in saying that we will do what is in our national interest. And what is in our national interest is lower oil prices, because the fact that I think we are reliant for more than 80% of our petroleum needs on imports. Actually, we should drill more, and we should get more oil domestically, but that's something already being done by Prime Minister Modi. But I'd like to say, Uday, very, very frankly, that India is standing firm on that, and India is not only standing firm, is standing firm in a very dignified and measured way. We are not responding to abusive language, not by President Trump, but by some others, who claim to be speaking for him. We are responding in a very cool, calm, and measured way. And I think the government is doing absolutely the right thing in responding in that way. And I do believe, honestly, the relationship between India and the United States is way too important for either country to walk away from, whether it's India, whether it's the United States. If the US were to do that, well, then what's going to happen is advantage to China, a huge advantage to China. And let's not forget, I think, I know some of the people who are involved in the Trump team, and they're all very, very sharp thinking people, and they understand the greatest existential threat to the United States comes from Russia, and not from Russia anymore, but from China. And from that point of view, giving an advantage to China by preventing India from importing Russian oil and thereby also angering the Russians and sabotaging any chance of the kind of peace that Donald Trump is looking for between Russia and Ukraine. In my view, President Trump is a very shrewd man. He will walk away from this policy.
Yes.
Yes, he's into making all kinds of posts,
Okay.
but I think disregard
Okay,
that.
let me take that to Ambassador Mukherjee. Ambassador Mukherjee, despite these reports, and one wonders how they came in the first place, despite various other maps that have disproven these reports. What do you make of India's decision on the issue of Russian imports going ahead? Right now, no change, as our sources are telling us. Is that a policy that is likely to continue according to you, despite these pressure tactics from the US?
As Professor Nalapat correctly pointed out, India will continue to act in its own national interests in a calm, dignified, and statesmanlike manner. As far as Russian oil is concerned, I am told that the difference between Russian oil at the moment and at the Brent rate is only $2 at the moment. So the price difference is minimal. At the same time, our oil companies have not taken any decision not to discontinue buying Russian oil, for the very simple reason that there is huge demand for the Russian oil that we buy and that we process in our refineries, and which is purchased mainly by the West, including by some outlets that then send it to the United States. So the point here is that what we are doing is perfectly legal. What we are doing is to ensure that our economic progress marches ahead. We are the world's fastest growing economy, even though President Trump unfortunately said India and Russia are dead economies and can go down together. I don't find that very diplomatic or very nice, but he said it in a tweet, unfortunately. Not a tweet, in his social harmony, whatever they call it. And the other issue is that we will buy according to demand. I was informed that the demand during this summer season was not very high because of unusual temperatures and weather patterns and a lot of rain. So the kind of demand for electricity that is normally generated all over India was much lower this year. And the rainy season has also come. But demand is picking up in some areas where it has now become exceptionally hot. So the demand is picking up. Under those circumstances, the oil companies will purchase at the optimal rate and in accordance with India's national interests. No decision has been taken to discontinue Russian oil at all. At the same time, for instance, there is a lot of talk that we are not going to buy the F-35, which is far too expensive and which apparently military experts feel is not conducive to Indian conditions. We are looking positively at buying Russian fighter planes, but we are looking positively at buying other US defense acquisitions which suit our present military conditions. So we will continue to do that. And as far as President Trump is concerned, I agree with Professor Nalapat that, and I will add another point. Yes, a lot of people say that he does this because he wants to pressure, he wants to blackmail, he wants to coerce, etc. Those tactics may work with some countries. They don't work very well with India because of our long history of being colonized, our sensitivity to foreign pressure, the fact that we are a democracy, the fact that the opposition and the media watch every step, and rightly so, of what the government is doing, etc. But there are also those who say that he's also doing it to divert attention from the growing scandal about its time. And that is something that is annoying his MAGA base. His MAGA base will also get extremely annoyed if a lot of Indian products which have presently been exempted, like pharma, get included. Because, for instance, pharma is hugely important for his MAGA base, because whenever you go to the United States and if you fall sick, the only thing they offer you is Tylenol. It's It's not at all like it is in India. You go to a chemist shop, there's such a vast variety and such a well-informed chemist who will tell you exactly, say, what, madam, kya problem hai, and he will take out the medicine, and it is so beautifully priced. It doesn't make a hole in your pocket. And the same thing is true in United States, where I've lived for 3 years in New York City. So that will dent his MAGA base. They will not like the fact that Indian pharma has gone up by 25, 30, 35%, whatever he ends up finally. That's why for the moment I was amused to find he's exempted pharma. That shows, as Professor Nalapat says, he's actually a very smart guy. He knows what's going to hurt him. So I think we have to see this through quietly and calmly, like the way we're doing. And according to the economists, and we have two more on our panel, I was told yesterday that if he does what he threatens, it will chop off 0.5% of our GDP. Today I read it will chop off 0.2% of our GDP, which means that instead of growing at 6.5%, we will grow at either 6% or at 6.03%, depending on what the economists finally come up with. Those are the figures I read from my friends who are economists. Therefore, it's not going to have a huge impact in any case, but it will hugely impact the Indo-US strategic partnership, and it will also impact people-to-people relations, and it will spread anti-Americanism across India, because for a long time, all American presidents had a huge approval rating in India. Indians felt America was good for us, America was supportive, American presidents were very supportive, etc. He is spoiling that with this barrage of tweets, which usually come around 2 a.m. from Washington, which makes me feel that maybe he spends the whole night just sending these messages directed at us and others. It is going to create anti-Americanism, I hope, since he's a smart guy, as Professor Nalapat says. I hope he's aware that he is unnecessarily creating anti-Americanism, which will impact India's foreign policy, which after all is dictated by the people, because we are a democracy, we are not a dictatorship. We can't decide policy according to the whims and fancies of a dictator. We have to go with the flow. And if there's anti-Americanism, it will be difficult for any government, regardless of who's in power, to continue with the present wide-ranging partnership that we built up carefully with the US over a period of time, beginning, if I may say, from the Manmohan Singh government till today. It was a process that cut across political parties, beginning with the famous India-US nuclear deal. Uday.
All right, let me join Mitali Nikore at this point. Mitali Nikore, tell us the economics of it all. Why does it suit us to buy oil from Russia and continue to do so despite these pressure tactics? How does it suit us economically? What is leading us not to bend to this pressure? Do you believe it is pragmatic economically to continue that? Or do you believe that there could be a change in our policy looking at the trade deal or the lack of one currently? What's your assessment?
So I think, Uday, first of all, I'd like to start by agreeing with both Professor Nalapat and Ambassador Mukherjee completely that, at the end of the day, India gets to trade with any country on its own terms. Those terms, of course, have to be fair and following a rules-based international order, as we have always done. So, we can't trade with a country that is literally using tariffs as an instrument of politics, because as we have seen in the last few months, these tariffs are being applied arbitrarily and not as part of an international rules based trading order. So that's the first point. The second point is, now when we look at the composition of India's trade to the US, we find that one of three of the most exposed sectors to these tariffs are electronics, textiles, and auto components. These are the three sectors which have the maximum exposure. Pharmaceuticals is obviously protected because it is in their own self-interest to protect it, as ma'am already said. But when we look at these three sectors, India was really looking towards expanding its manufacturing base in these sectors. When we look at the fact that iPhones were being manufactured in India, so for so many years, I was actually wondering this yesterday, for 20 years nearly, China kept on exporting, mobile phones to the US. But this question never came up. Now today, when India has actually started developing its capacity to do it, we are finding ourselves in this situation where only this one mobile phone from the Apple iPhone being exported is being highlighted. But there are so many other electronics goods that India needs to manufacture, needs to gain the expertise to manufacture, and we of course need to have access to a global market to be able to manufacture that at scale. So I think for our manufacturing sectors ambitions to go forward, in high technology sectors like semiconductors, like electronics, like tech goods, like even machinery and machine equipment, we need to have access to more global markets. But does that have to be just the US market? Absolutely not. We have just concluded a very successful trade deal with the UK. We are currently in the middle of negotiation of the trade deal with EU. We are going to be looking at newer and newer markets like Japan and South Korea. We can work with them. We can work with the BRICS countries as a bloc. We have a lot of options for continuing ahead with our growth. And I think the Prime Minister also said, the third point I'd like to make is what the Prime Minister said yesterday. He said it is now time for Indians to purchase goods which have been made with the blood and sweat of Indians. And I think at some point we all have to realize that even we have to play a role in this, in propelling India's consumption story forward. And we have to start making a conscious effort, if not 100%, but at least some effort to buy more of Indian products. Having said that, will there be an impact of these tariffs? It is undoubted that there will be an impact of these tariffs. We can say that in the first year, it could be somewhere between 0.2 to 0.5% in the GDP growth. But that is only the first round of effects. There is going to be a second round, third round knock on effect. As we know, in cyclical terms in the macro economy, it will impact consumption. And this is where I think the government needs to tackle this head on, accept that there will be an impact, and also protect the most vulnerable classes, protect the poor, protect the low income people, and make sure that, like we did at the time of COVID, we put in place very strong social protection mechanisms to protect the vulnerable communities. And finally, I'd like to say, when we look at our agriculture sector, when we look at our dairy sectors, at this point, we have obviously had to protect them, because when you're dealing with a country like the US, where the large amount of subsidies are being given to the agriculture economy in the US for decades, we are facing a situation where those products could be just dumped in our country. We can't have that. But at the same time, we have to now strengthen our agricultural economy and dairy economy. We cannot continue also in the way that we have, creating over regulation in these sectors. It's time for a serious relook at how we can strengthen our own economy as well.
Okay, Dr. Jaideep Bhattacharya, let me draw you in here as well on, of course, the vested interests that are at play once again here with this slanted reportage. Does it surprise you anymore, firstly? Secondly, looking at how things stand currently, do you believe it's unlikely that there will be any change in policy? And what is the economics of it all?
Clearly there is a slant, right? And it will be a slant by the Western media, which will be for the Western media. In US, it will be a slant which will be aligned to the interest of the US people. The surprising part is that we have media in this country which is not aligned to the interest of Indian people. So that's a different story altogether. Therefore, Newsx as a channel is much favored because it speaks in the interest of the Indian people. Having said that, what is it that the West is misrepresenting? Let's take one example of energy imports from Russia, because that's what's being talked about. India is importing roughly, let's say, 650 million barrels of oil from Russia. And let's take that at face value. How much of uranium is being imported by the US? It's about 335 tons of enriched uranium being imported. So how do we compare uranium with oil? Because both are essentially energy imports. We're not using these for anything else, but largely for energy. 335 tons of enriched uranium is more than equal to 800 million barrels of oil. And what we are importing from Russia is much lesser. So US continues to import much more energy from Russia than what we are. and that's being completely glossed over. I'm not even talking about what the Europe is importing. I'm not even talking about what Turkey and Germany are importing, and anything that the US needs or the Europe needs, that is excluded from the targets of what needs to be or not needs to be purchased from Russia. So the African countries, India and so on, has to face the brunt of the whims and fancies of the West, and in this case, of one single individual, because clearly it seems that the US is no more being run through a democratic process, but power has been concentrated with one person. That's the wish of the American people, and that's fine. But when they're pontifying India about buying of procuring energy from Russia, the same in much larger quantity is being done by the US. And it's been an old habit of picking up one or two things in the portfolio of trade between US and India and making that as an example. For quite some time, it was Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson motorcycles were not even a rounding of error in terms of imports from US to India. And it never became, even after reduction of the tariffs, there was no impact of Harley Davidson. They had to pack up their bags and leave, and then come back only through joint ventures, because on their own they could not produce equipment and motorcycles which could win in this market. We have had the Japanese, the Koreans, and even the Chinese winning in the automobile market in India, but largely the US players have been wiped out. So there is a deeper thought that the Americans have to do, because automobiles is a significant portion of any economy. Typically, it's about 20% of any economy, and if they're not competitive in that sector, then that's where one conjures up things like tariffs. It just indicates that the US economy seems to have got weaker in the perspective of the US president, because typically you bring up tariffs when your economy is not strong, which is why developing countries who are under centuries of colonial rule, their industry is completely wiped out. They needed tariffs in order to support their infantile industry, not a giant economy like the US. But if the perception is that the US economy has become weakened up, it is not as good as even the infantile industries in the developing countries, then perhaps that's why the government of US is going for such large measures of tariff. It can no longer compete with the rest of the world on an even footing. And the way the reality is being put and projected in the media, which is being pushed by the West, is completely different from reality. Because the reality is the US is procuring more energy from Russia than India is. The US industries is getting weak for whatever reason. And if they move into labor intensive industries, that labor will not be human labor, it will be robotic labor, and therefore that will not lead to more jobs in US. And with all the inflation coming in, there will be a reduced purchasing power in US, which will then lead to all the things that Mitali was talking about. It will have its own repercussions, where it will be a vicious reduction of the global economy as well as the US economy. And with more job loss in US, there will be lesser purchasing power. So it becomes a vicious cycle that they will fall into, triggered by the steps that are being taken now. And again, this is nothing new. This is well known. In the 1930s, that's how the Great Depression happened. And in fact, every 100 years, 1830, there was a depression that happened in US because of tariffs. 1930s, similar thing. 20, 25, similar thing. Every 100 years, US seems to be shooting itself in the foot by misinformed policies in terms of tariff. And it's going to have an impact all over the world, like it happened in 1930.
All right, let me just in fact take that to once again back across to Ambassador Mukherjee before we get a closing comment from Professor Nalapat. We're almost out of time now. Ambassador Mukherjee, first on, of course, now this these remarks from the United States President on the issue of Russia. Is it more to do with putting pressure on Russia and Medvedev, and is that why he's trying to weave in India? Do you believe these are negotiating tactics for the trade deal? What do you read between the lines?
I think it's a combination of both. First of all, I have been informally told by my colleagues in MEA that he is extremely frustrated at our very statesman-like and measured response. We've not overreacted. That is the right way to handle somebody who's as volatile as he is, dangerously volatile, to be U.S. president, in fact, with his finger on the nuclear button. Uh, the other issue is that he is trying to make India, through pressure, give up all defense and oil purchases with Russia and swing towards the United States without any consideration, as Professor Nalapad said, of our national interest, of the costs involved. For instance, each F-35 costs $1 billion, etc. And to do that, he is quite happy to bully us in public. At the same time, he is trying to bully Putin, because when he came to power, he said that within I think 6 weeks, he said he'll put an end to the conflict in Ukraine. That's what he said, and there doesn't seem to be any lowering of the tensions at all. In fact, it would appear to me that this conflict is not going anywhere. It is stalemated. The Ukrainians have lost territory. They're never going to get it
Yes.
back. It has stalemated in a situation where you can talk about new frontier
Yes.
lines between Ukraine and Russia. So I think, to answer your question, Uday, he's putting pressure on both for
Okay.
different.
Okay. So it's a bit of both. All right. We are out of time. Professor Nalapad, 30 seconds too.
Yeah.
30 seconds. Last word.
Yeah, look, I only want to say, I think the government of India, led by Prime Minister Modi, has been taking steps in a large number of ways, including, for example, in Atmanirbharta, in our nuclear power industry, in our space industry. By the way, we are working at an increased level of collaboration with the US on that, on nuclear as well. We are doing that, and I can assure you, Uday, across the board, the cooperation in the US and India are doing well. Not, I mean, different types of cooperation are doing well, not because it's good for India, because it's good for the US. Now, cheap pharma, for example, can you tell me any MAGA supporter? I mean, many of them are low-income Americans who will be happy if the price of medicine jump, by 100, 200%. Not at all. It's Indian pharma that's keeping a check,
Yes.
not American pharma, once
Yes.
again gouging the consumer.
Okay.
And from that point of view, the overall Indian economy is doing well. And the US, I think, under President Trump, will understand that sooner than later, and we will have a better situation.
All right. I'm taking a very short break at that point. My thanks to all of our guests for joining us on this discussion.